All right, hello everyone. We're back for part 4, which is our final part of our lecture. We're going to talk about the 20th century. A lot of very, very interesting things happened in the 20th century, and it's hard to cover such a diverse period of time in just 2 musical examples. So, but in order to kind of keep with our trend, I'm going to talk about Bela Bartok and one of his monumental string quartets, and George Crumb, a composer who used graphic notation as a part of his musical procedure. So we'll get to that term shortly, but let's talk about Bela Bartok first. Some of the things that we've heard in regards to the 20th century, just in terms of minimalism, perhaps, is that there is a sense or a tendency to want to experiment with the dimension of rhythm. And rhythm wasn't really, at least in regards to the Western classical canon, deeply explored until the 20th century. Pieces from the Baroque era and the classical era really do adhere to one particular time signature more than any, like being a mixed meter, for example. We have a grand sense of rhythmic regularity in those, in music in general from those two eras. In the Romantic era, we still are within the confines of a particular meter or rhythm, but the thing that's changing is that instead of having just like rhythmic regularity, we have some sort of push and pull, some sort of ebb and flow, some flexibility within that kind of construct. When I think about rubato, I often think about like meter being, like if we're looking at a coloring book, meter being the lines of the coloring book. And if we're to put compositional material inside of those lines, i.e. color inside the lines, that's to be mechanical in time. But rubato has this sense of kind of coloring outside of the lines, that kind of flexibility where you're not quite getting to the edge or you're going past it. So that's in the Romantic era. That's kind of as far as the advancements in rhythm go. We certainly also hear a lot of music that's moving on a section by section basis that's in one particular rhythm or meter, or accelerandos or rallentondos, as we heard in the Schubert and the WC examples. The idea there, though, is that like music was mostly, not exclusively, but tended to have a kind of more cinematic or narrative quality to it. That's not necessarily carried over in the 20th century. We don't have this same kind of propensity to things with a narrative quality, although we do see it quite and hear it quite a bit. But we do want to experiment with rhythm a little bit more liberally. So Bartok, the first example that we have, Bartok usually has one of many rhythmic identifiers, but one of the things that makes his music particularly his is the sense of creating a pulse, but changing where the stresses occur, making this sort of like combination of regularity and irregularity. We're going to listen to 2 excerpts of the Bartok String Quartet. I want you to also, like, as we discovered, like we're responsible for 3 things at the moment: what's happening texturally, what's happening rhythmically, what's happening with the instrumentation. Instrumentation here, string quartet, which is wonderful. Same instrumentation that we've been dealing with. So let's figure out what's happening texturally and what's happening rhythmically. I've already given you a preview as to what's happening perhaps rhythmically, is that we're going to have some sort of inconsistency here and irregularity. So trying to figure that out is going to be difficult. And then we're also left with the idea of like, well, what's happening then texturally? Are we listening to monophonic, homophonic, heterophonic, or polyphonic? So let's take a listen and see where we're at. Okay, here we go. So we are listening to Bartok's String Quartet number 4, movement number 5. here's our pulse. But where one is constantly shifting around. Slowing down suddenly and speeding up. Awesome. What a cool section of this entire piece. Lots of rhythmic complexity going here, but we had like a kind of steady pulse, but where our accents were happening were completely like thrown off a lot. So we had a lot of asymmetrical meter, we had a lot of mixed meter. We also had plenty of like we had a couple of rallentandos, like where we were pulling things a little bit slower and then snapping right back into tempo. So we have this kind of flexibility that really only exists past the Romantic era. In terms of the material here that's being used, though, it's much more strident, much more dissonant than we heard in the Romantic era, and certainly fails the elevator test. The idea of like being a sort of like calming middle ground presence. One of the other things that like it qualifies the elevator test is the idea like in the elevator test, the passing is like everything is kind of the same volume. Here we have volume all over the place, from very, very loud to very, very soft. So when we have a lot of disparity between those kinds of dynamic ideas, we're generally thinking of time periods that are after the Romantic era, or at least Romantic era on. So texturally, what's happening here? We had a lot of monophonic texture where everyone is acting in unison together. We had a lot of call and response that's happening. We had also a lot of just like straight homophonic texture. A lot of like also two against two or one against three. About as like maybe a little bit less movement oriented than the two Romantic era examples. And that's mostly because the complexity already exists in the realm of the rhythm that's happening here. Let's go to another section of this same string quartet by Bartók. Okay, so I'm really hoping that this doesn't get cut because it's a slightly nicer example, but this is the pizzicato movement of the same string quartet. And what's happening here is that we're listening to a lot of percussive techniques using both regular pizzicato and snap pizzicato. And what's happening here is that because we're using a percussive technique, it's much harder to identify who's going to be the most important thing to listen to. So much like the issue that we encountered with minimalism, it might be harder to distinguish like who's most important, and therefore everyone is equally important. Let's take a listen. So we have a steady pulse, but where one is happening is it happening at irregular intervals. that like rubber band sort of snapping sound. That's the sound of a snap pizzicato. Very good. The rest of it is not particularly long, but I'd love to keep it on the shorter side so it can stay in with my commentary, hopefully, crossing my fingers. So the rest of the piece goes on very similarly though. Because everyone is reduced to this very percussive technique that eliminates a lot of the actual pitch content, it is much harder to figure out who's most important to listen to. When that happens, what we're inevitably left with is like some sort of polyphonic texture. And this comes as a result of the extended technique that's used. And the extended techniques that we used here, we had a glissando in the cello part in combination with the pizzicato, plucking the strings. Notice that no one has the bow up in this video. We also were like strumming at some point, which is a different technique all on its own, and using snap pizzicato, where we're actually, it has like a kind of rubber band snapping back on the instrument sound. George Crumb is the last composer that we're going to talk about. He is still living, although not necessarily in wonderful health, which is such a bummer. One of the things that makes him a particularly interesting and important composer is that his scores look considerably different than any others that we'll encounter for the rest of the semester. And it's because he uses what we call graphic notation. And graphic notation means that you're using some sort of pictorial or symbolic element within the score design to give you some idea about the score. Graphic notation can use colors, it can use textures, it can use just regular paper with different like non-traditional musical symbols, but generally that's something that is new and novel and a method that is experimented with in the 20th century, especially like mid-century and on. And George Crumb's scores are really a beautiful piece of artwork in addition to being interesting musical concoctions, I guess I will call them, because some of them are really interesting in how they combine different elements of like music and theater together, for example. We're going to listen to his piece or a selection of his string quartet called Black Angels. And this is like pretty far out for a string quartet. The string quartet is amplified and is using additional percussive instruments to further the instrumental palette that the composer is writing for. Sometimes they speak and or sing and play at the same time, but the string quartet is really like kind of pushed to its maximum capacity in terms of the different kinds of timbres that are available to the quartet. So, graphic notation. Let's take a look at what George Crumb's piece even looks like. Okay, so this is the selection of George Crumb's Black Angels that we're going to listen to. This is going to be movement number 7. So this is graphic notation, and very specifically, this is something we call a cutaway score. So when an instrument is not being played, we see nothing here. Note that like there's no time signature here, there's no bar lines. There's a lot of information that we're used to that's missing. What's nice though is that graphic notation can tell you a lot about what the piece sounds like without or before even getting to hear it. So furiously with great energy, a 16th note equals 200 beats per minute. That is crazy fast. All of these right here are 16th notes. So as soon as we figure out what 200 is, each of these receives the same value. Notice that they're all doing mew, mew, mew together. They're even beamed together. So this whole thing right here is monophonic in texture. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7 quick hits together. This symbol right here says do not take a breath. Okay, that means like continue on to this next event. This hurdle with a 3 above it means that this event is held for a duration of 3 seconds. And it includes a trill, an oscillation between 2 different pitches that eventually go down. These 3 instruments are again acting in unison together, so this is a continuation of monophonic texture. These 3 instruments pluck while this instrument continues on with a different line. That means this moment right here is homophonic in texture. Because this is alone, monophonic in texture. These 3 instruments shout something. Group 1 versus group 2, that means homophonic texture. Then we have mew, 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 that is displaced in time. Mew, 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 that's imitative. Awesome. Once we have this imitation, guess what? All 4 of these parts come together and play the same thing at the same time. That means monophonic in texture. We could go through every single page of the score exactly like this, but we're not going to. The entire quartet plays from the score. So no one is looking at an individual part, which is how you would typically play a string quartet. Everyone is aware of what everyone else is doing always. It's necessary because there's this graphic element to the notation. So I'm only going to play less than a minute of this just to illustrate the section that I talked about and then the next section. And I'll talk about it. But again, what I really don't want is for the entire video to get cut. So let's just listen to a small bit of Black Angels. Again, what's happening here is obviously like a lot of movement in terms of the texture moving around and a lot of extended techniques, a lot of difference in volume, and it's definitely going to be elevator unsafe. So let's go ahead and take a listen. Sorry, let me start from the beginning. Imitative, monophonic, homophonic, monophonic. Okay, so the piece sounds like a bunch of bees, kind of. It's a very terrifying piece of music. Certainly not elevator safe. Why? Because there's so much irregularity that's built into the piece of music. The other sections are totally different than this, less violent, but still very eerie and unsettling and strange. And experimenting a lot with the different timbres and tone colors that you can get out of all of the instruments of the string quartet. Which kind of brings me to my conclusion, because we can't just talk about string instruments for more than one session. This is a close look at 3 of the different instruments that are within the string family of the orchestra. The only one that I left out is the double bass. The double bass, somewhat similar to the cello, although it's played standing up and kind of lacks a little bit of the mobility that the cello does have, which is the reason why it is, again, left out of the string quartet. We're going to encounter the double bass in orchestral repertoire for a number of examples later on in the semester. But bigger takeaways here. String quartet is a chamber ensemble of 4 people that evolves over time. The idea that it starts with as a group that has a lot of clarity to it. Homophonic texture, regularly recurring rhythms. And as we go into the 20th century, those ideas are questioned and tested. And we hear a lot more diversity when it comes to who gets to play the melody, and a lot more diversity in terms of texture moving around, and also including rhythmic variety, from the presence of rubato, pushing and pulling time, to more complicated rhythmic designs that are included in things like George Crumb's Black Angels. So when we return for our next class, we're going to talk about Out with the Old, In with the New, which is a lecture which talks about 20th century composers who were interested in writing for instruments that didn't exist from the orchestra, and why that is. So I will see you guys for our next lecture, likely tomorrow. Bye.